The hum of the airplane cabin wrapped the narrow aisle in a low, steady murmur, a restless sea of voices and shuffling bags. Frank Whitaker moved carefully, not from indecision, but from a lifetime's worth of burden stitched into his bones. His cap, faded from years of sun, sat low on his brow, the gold thread of Vietnam veteran dulled by time. They saw an old man, but they didn't see the battles he still carried, or the moment, minutes from now, that would silence the whole cabin. Each step was deliberate, measured. He adjusted the strap of his worn duffel and pressed forward, wincing slightly as he reached for the overhead bin. A small tremor betrayed the quiet war raging in his lower back, a constant ache, a stubborn reminder of battles never fully left behind. 2 rows back, a boy slouched deep into his seat, sneakers planted against the back of the tray table in front of him. Tyler, 16, hoodie half-zipped, earbuds dangling, thumbs flying across his phone screen. His mouth curved into a grin as his eyes locked onto Frank. He leaned toward his friend across the aisle, voice low but sharp. "Looks like Jurassic Park has a new exhibit." Muted laughter. Tyler smirked, lifted his phone and snapped a picture. Frank, head bowed, back bent, a silhouette against the sterile lighting of the cabin. He tapped out a caption, "Grandpa Air." His friend stifled a snort. Frank didn't hear. Or maybe he chose not to. He placed his duffel gently into the bin, adjusted the brim of his cap, and shuffled toward his seat. They saw an old man. They didn't see the battles still etched into his slow movements, or the moment, minutes from now, that would turn this laughter into silence. Frank settled into his seat, breathing out a slow, careful breath as he eased into the tight space. He caught a glimpse of the clouds through the window, low, heavy, brooding. Weather, or maybe just the weight of the air he carried with him. Behind him, Tyler tapped away, crafting his post, oblivious to the gravity sitting 2 rows ahead, and Frank closed his eyes, not from fatigue, but to brace himself for the journey ahead. Some wounds, he thought, don't bleed. They wait. The cabin's steady hum faded, and Frank slipped into the corridors of memory, carried backward, not to safety, but into the thick, choked lungs of the jungle. The air was a living thing, heavy with heat and tension. Every step he took sank his boots deeper into the wet, sucking earth. The undergrowth closed around him like a trap, vines coiling, branches clawing at his sleeves. Somewhere beyond the dense green, Lieutenant Johnson waited, or what remained of him. Find him. Bring him home. Simple orders, spoken without understanding. Frank pressed forward, one cautious step at a time, the barrel of his rifle steady, breath locked tight in his lungs. The jungle whispered around him, not the sounds of birds or wind, but the near silence of something unseen, waiting, watching. Every rustle, every cracked twig underfoot sounded deafening in the hush. He could feel it, the invisible eyes, the breath of death brushing close. He was naked out here, stripped of protection, of numbers. Just a man alone, slipping into a den where predators didn't hunt for food, but for vengeance. In the breast pocket of his fatigues, folded carefully, was a photo, black and white, worn at the edges, of Johnson. A boyish smile, too young for war, too old for innocence. Johnson had shown it to Frank days earlier, tracing the face of the infant girl in his arms. "Gotta get back," Johnson had said, voice low, serious in a way Frank hadn't forgotten. "She's waiting on me. Little Linda. My girl's got her whole life ahead. She's just got to know her old man was there at the start." Frank clenched his jaw. The memory of those words drove him forward, through the thorns, the mud, the looming silence that seemed to thicken with each step. Then, a shift in the air, a wrongness, the hiss of air, faint, deadly. A grenade struck the earth near his boots with a dull, decisive thud. There was no time. Instinct tore him sideways, hurling his body off the edge of a shallow ravine. The ground gave way beneath him, and he fell, weightless for a heartbeat, then landing with brutal force on a jagged incline. His back screamed in protest, fire shooting up his spine, stealing the breath from his lungs. Dirt filled his mouth. Pain filled the world. Above him, blurred by foliage and agony, came a voice, faint, broken, Johnson's voice. Frank. It wasn't a shout. It was a call for help, a call heavy with trust, with belief, a voice worn and wounded, reaching out into the void. Frank tried to move. His arms obeyed. His back did not. He clawed at the mud, every muscle trembling, but the world swam and tilted. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant," he whispered, his face pressed into the bitter earth, his hand still clutching the photo against his chest. The jungle swallowed the voice. The earth grew still, and Frank was left with the one thing war always gave in the end: guilt. The hum of the engines pressed against the cabin walls, a steady vibration beneath their feet. Above, fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow, washing the faces of the passengers in pale fatigue. Frank shifted, a slight grimace tugging at the corner of his mouth. His back pulsed with that familiar bitter ache, a phantom reminder of the ravine, of the voice that had called out to him and been swallowed by the jungle. He moved with deliberate care, hands steadying on the seatbacks, rising inch by slow inch. The seatbelt light had only just winked off, but Frank knew better than to wait. The price of hesitation would be far worse. He edged into the aisle. Around him, eyes flicked up, curious, impatient. Step by step, he shuffled toward the restroom, his body stiff, each movement an act of stubborn dignity. Behind him, Tyler smirked, elbowing his friend again. "Hope he makes it before sunset," he muttered, loud enough for the rows around them to hear. A ripple of laughter followed, not cruel in its intention, but no less cutting in its casual cruelty. Frank kept moving, head low. He didn't see Tyler lift his phone once more, lining up a quick shot of the empty aisle. A blurred photo. A caption typed with careless fingers. "Where'd Grandpa wander off to?" The plane's narrow path funneled Frank's slow progress, and as he finally disappeared into the cramped confines of the restroom, the laughter thickened behind him. Across the cabin, a flight attendant watched, her brow furrowed. She caught Tyler's laughter, the flashing screen of his phone. Her lips pressed into a thin line, disapproval visible, but she said nothing. The world didn't scold boys like Tyler for what it taught them to mock. Inside the restroom, Frank gripped the walls, steadying himself against the turbulence of memory and age. The mirror gave back a face he barely recognized, lines carved deep by sun, wind, and sorrow. He straightened, pulling his shoulders back, willing the pain to quiet. Outside, the whispers softened, hidden behind the clatter of drink carts and the rustle of overhead bins. Phones slid away. Conversations resumed. The old soldier, their entertainment for the moment, was gone. But the stain of their laughter lingered, like smoke in the closed cabin air. Frank emerged from the narrow restroom, carefully bracing himself against the wall as the plane rocked in mild turbulence. He steadied his breath, his hand trembling slightly, from exertion, from age, from the memory still bleeding through him. The aisle stretched long before him, a gauntlet of indifferent faces. He shuffled back toward his seat, slow, deliberate, every movement measured against the silent weight on his back. Just as he reached his row, a sharp voice sliced through the low hum. "Sir, we need you to move." He turned. A flight attendant, younger than his youngest grandchild, crisp uniform, efficient smile, stood in his path. Her voice was polite, but her eyes were firm, final. "Move?" Frank asked, confusion threading his tone. "Yes, sir," she repeated, adjusting her clipboard. "A VIP guest is boarding. We need this row." She didn't soften the words with apology. The statement was transactional, a minor inconvenience to be corrected. Frank shifted, instinctively pressing a palm against his lower back. "I have a condition. The aisle helps me if I need to get up," he explained, voice low, steady, respectful. The attendant's smile tightened. "Middle seat in the back is all we have left, sir. If you prefer not to move." Her words paused, deliberate. "We may have to delay departure." Behind Frank, the subtle symphony of irritation rose, passengers shifting, sighing. A man near the window let out an audible groan. Another adjusted his watch pointedly, a silent accusation that time was being wasted. Frank absorbed it all without a word. The murmurs, the stares, the collective pressure pressing against him, heavier than the duffel on his shoulder. Slowly, with the quiet resignation of a man who had known far greater indignities, he reached for his bag. Tyler watched it unfold with mild amusement, slouched deep in his seat. Another elbow to his friend, another snicker. Frank made his way toward the back, each step slower than the last. The plane, vast and narrow all at once, stretched longer than it should have. He squeezed into the cramped middle seat, knees pressed to the tray table, shoulders pinched between two strangers who offered no glance, no courtesy. He adjusted, grimacing, as the limited space refused to yield. The ache in his back flared, sharp and unrelenting, but sharper still was the quiet humiliation, a wound without blood, without bandage. Tyler glanced back once, his smirk flickering briefly. Then he returned to his phone, thumbs dancing, documenting another moment. Frank folded his hands in his lap, closed his eyes, and exhaled. The cabin vibrated with the engine's steady pulse, indifferent to the small invisible defeats happening in seat 42B. The cabin lights dimmed, casting the rows in a hush of muted gold. Outside the window, the sky blurred into twilight, a soft bleeding of colors, as if even the sun was reluctant to leave the day behind. Frank shifted in his narrow seat, the armrests pressing against him like silent accusations. His hand crept instinctively to his lower back, tracing the familiar path of pain. But it was not the ache of flesh that held him prisoner. It was the weight, heavy and invisible, that had bound itself to his soul decades ago. And it bore one name: Johnson. Darkness. The thick, smothering dark of a jungle night. Frank sat hunched in the corner of the medevac, knees drawn close, boots scuffed and blood-stained. The rotors above hammered at the sky, but all he could hear was the silence between beats, the silence where Johnson's voice should have been. In his hands, he cradled a letter. The paper was soft, fragile from blood and rain, creased from too many foldings. Lieutenant Johnson's last words to a home he would never see again. A wife, a baby girl barely a year old. But Johnson had been more than a commanding officer. He had been the kind of man who made war seem bearable. A steady hand, a quiet laugh when the nights got too long, a rare voice that spoke of home like it was something real, something waiting. Johnson saw family not as a distant hope, but as a sacred trust. He cared for his men with a fierce, almost fatherly devotion, carrying their burdens when they grew too heavy to shoulder alone. Frank had followed Johnson not because he had to, but because trust was a rare currency in war, and Johnson spent it without reserve. When the skirmish hit their camp, and chaos broke like a storm around them, Johnson could have pulled back, could have retreated to safety. But that wasn't who he was. He stayed behind, moving through the smoke and gunfire, pulling the wounded from the mud, shouting orders hoarse over the din, a lighthouse refusing to go dark. It cost him everything. Frank pressed the blood-stained letter tighter to his chest, feeling the frail crackle of the paper, as if the last threads of Johnson's life still clung to it. He hadn't been able to save him. Not Johnson, the man who would have given his life for any of them without a blink. Not the brother he had leaned on through the endless march of days. The guilt was not that Johnson had died. It was that when the moment came, Frank hadn't been there to reach back for the hand that had always been there for him. Back in the present, Frank blinked against the overhead light. It was too bright, too harsh, too unforgiving. He shifted, the cramped seat pressing tighter around him. The ache in his back flared sharp, but it was a ghost compared to the hollow ache behind his ribs. Some wounds, he knew, were stitched into bone and soul alike. Some never healed at all. Near the front of the plane, the cockpit lights blinked in a steady rhythm, green and gold, like distant stars. Linda Johnson clipped her seatbelt free, and unfastened her headset, her checklist complete, the hum of altitude steady beneath her boots. Routine, automatic, the kind of comfort that came after years in the sky. Linda was not new to these skies. Middle-aged now, with hair pulled tight in a no-nonsense bun streaked with early gray, she wore her uniform with a crispness that wasn't about vanity. It was about respect. Every thread, every polished pin, every careful movement was a small homage to the life that had shaped her. Born into a military family, she had grown up under the quiet shadow of service. Her father's boots by the door, his medals tucked away in drawers rather than on display. From him, she had learned that honor never fades. It settles deeper with time. That duty never ends. It simply changes shape. Those lessons hadn't left her. They had shaped the spine she stood on now, the eyes that scanned her passengers not for comfort, but for the unseen burdens they carried. Her gaze swept the cabin, tired travelers blinking at movies, stirring cream into plastic cups of coffee. And then she paused. Row 42. A man, older than most, slumped into the cramped middle seat, his hands folded quietly in his lap. His head bowed, the brim of his cap tilted downward. She couldn't see his eyes, but the cap itself caught her attention. Faded, sun-worn, Vietnam veteran stitched into the fabric, the gold thread dulled from years and salt and sun. Something pricked at the back of her mind. Not recognition, not yet, but a tug, gentle and persistent, like memory stirring from a long sleep. Linda moved on, completing her rounds, but the image clung to her, stubborn, insistent. Later, seated again in the cockpit, she tapped her phone awake and scrolled past landscapes and flight manuals until she found it. A black and white snapshot, worn thin at the corners. A group of soldiers, arms slung over one another's shoulders. In the center, her father, Lieutenant Johnson, smiling in that way soldiers do before the world breaks and remakes them. But it wasn't her father her eyes locked onto. Beside him, a younger man, solemn and solid. The kind of man who didn't need to smile to be trusted. Frank Whitaker. Stories rose unbidden. Bedtime stories not about war, but about character. About a man her father had called brother in arms. About a loyalty forged not in ceremony, but in the mud and blood of places most men tried to forget. She remembered the way her mother spoke of Frank, her voice always soft, reverent. How her father once said, "If you ever meet Frank Whitaker, tell him he never let me down." Linda exhaled slowly, the realization settling heavy in her chest. Frank Whitaker was sitting 3 rows behind her, alone, unnoticed, mocked by boys too young to understand the cost of the peace they took for granted. And Linda Johnson knew exactly what she had to do. The cabin lights flickered once as the plane slid deeper into the night sky, steady at 30,000 feet. Conversation buzzed low, a background hum against the engine's endless churn. Movies played silently behind glassy eyes, the occasional clink of a coffee cup, the shuffle of restless feet. Linda Johnson stood, not abruptly, not for attention. She adjusted the cuffs of her uniform, the navy blue fabric crisp under her fingers, and smoothed the wings pinned over her heart. She didn't glance toward the passengers who might notice, nor toward her fellow crew members. None of them knew the weight she carried now, a weight passed down from a father to a daughter, a weight made of promises not yet kept. Step by step, she moved down the narrow aisle. The moment her shoes touched the carpet, a shift rippled through the air, subtle, like the tightening of a wire stretched too long. Heads turned, a few curious glances flickering her way. But she didn't notice them. Her eyes were locked on one seat, one man. Frank Whitaker, row 42, middle seat. Still slumped, his hands folded in patient defeat, his cap shading a face carved by time and silence. Linda paused beside him. The world seemed to hold its breath. She knelt, quietly, respectfully, lowering herself until she met him at eye level. Frank blinked, startled at first, his body tensing. Passengers nearby stirred, sensing without knowing that something was happening. something different. Linda's voice was low, steady, but it carried, threading into the quiet around them. "Sir, on behalf of someone you once tried to save, someone I loved, may I offer you something long overdue?" Frank's brow furrowed, confusion clouding the stillness of his face. "Lieutenant Johnson was my father," she said, her words sure, unshaking. "You didn't fail him. He spoke of you in his last letters, said you were the kind of man a soldier could trust with his life." Frank opened his mouth, to speak, to protest, but nothing came. His breath caught in his throat, heavy with decades of silence and unshed words. Linda didn't wait. She brought her hand sharply to her brow and rendered a crisp, formal salute, the kind given not out of obligation, but out of respect forged in bone and memory. She held it longer than regulation required, longer than tradition demanded, because some salutes were not for the living alone. Some were for the promises left behind. The cabin froze. No whispers, no laughter. Tyler, mid-scroll on his phone, froze as the weight of the moment settled into his chest like a stone. His hand hovered, still clutching the screen, the last photo unsent. The laughter that had filled the aisle earlier evaporated, replaced by something heavier, sharper. And in that silence, something began to shift. Linda lowered her hand with measured grace, her salute complete, but the tension in the cabin remained. A taut wire stretched across the silence. She stood slowly, facing the rows of faces now turned toward her. For a moment, no one moved. The air itself seemed thicker, heavier, as if waiting for permission to breathe again. Linda's voice, when it came, was low, not harsh, not sharp, but with a weight that left no room for misunderstanding. "Some of you laughed," she said, her eyes sweeping the rows, pausing not on any one face, but somehow seeing them all. "Some of you looked away." A beat, silence thick enough to drown in. "Maybe you didn't know what you were seeing," she continued, her tone not accusing, but heavy with the ache of disappointment. "This man, Staff Sergeant Frank Whitaker, is not just an old soldier. He is a quiet hero, one of the forgotten ones who gave more than we will ever understand so that we could sit here today in peace, free to mock or respect as we choose." Heads lowered, ashamed. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the words cutting not with anger, but with the weight of truth. "Honor doesn't wear a uniform forever," Linda said, her voice gentling, "and it doesn't fade with age. Sometimes it moves a little slower, carries a few more scars, but it deserves no less respect." Another pause, deliberate, allowing the words to sink deeper, to leave their mark. "Let's not forget again." Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, movement rippled through the cabin. A man near the back rose to his feet, head bowed. Then another, and another. The whisper of clothing brushing against seats as more passengers stood, not hurried, not performative, but solemn, heavy with the understanding that they stood not out of pity, but out of belated respect. Linda offered Frank her hand. He hesitated only a moment before taking it, his grip firm despite the years that weighed on him. She helped him to his feet, steadying him as he straightened his back, wincing slightly. Tyler sat frozen in his seat, his phone still in his hand. He looked down at the screen, the mocking photo still open, and his thumb hovered over it. Slowly, almost reverently, he tapped delete. The image vanished. For a moment, Tyler sat still, staring at the blank screen. In his mind, unbidden, surfaced a memory. His grandfather, old and worn in his easy chair, telling him in a gruff voice he'd never cared to understand, "The peace you enjoy was bought with blood, boy. Never forget that." Back then, it had sounded like just another lecture. Like all the others, Tyler had half heard and brushed aside. But now, watching Frank Whitaker move down the aisle, slower, smaller, but not diminished, Tyler felt it, the weight of those words. Frank wasn't just an old man. He was the living proof of sacrifices Tyler had never bothered to imagine. A sermon given not in words, but in quiet, relentless endurance. Tyler's gaze lifted to Frank, standing now with a dignity no uniform could add or subtract from. The boy said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence was its own apology. The aisle cleared without a word as Linda led Frank forward, her steps slow to match his, measured by more than just the plane's narrow confines, measured by the gravity of the moment. And as Frank Whitaker moved down the aisle, he no longer carried the weight of invisible battles alone. The first-class cabin opened before them. Wider seats, softer lights, a hush that seemed almost sacred after the narrow press of the aisle. Linda guided Frank gently toward an empty seat near the window. Seat 1A. It had been reserved earlier that day, but the occupant had missed their flight. A small detail, a forgotten seat, waiting, and somehow, as if by quiet design, it was waiting for him. Frank lowered himself carefully, the wide seat accepting him like an old friend. He eased back, exhaling slow through his nose, feeling the stiffness in his spine release by degrees. For a long moment, he simply sat, hands resting on the armrests, his old cap folded neatly in his lap, its faded gold stitching gleaming dully under the soft cabin lights. Around him, the plane hummed its endless tune. Passengers returned slowly to their seats, conversations hushed now, as if the air itself demanded it. Some stole glances toward the front, but there were no more whispers, no more laughter. Frank turned toward the window. Outside, the sky stretched endless and pale, a mantle of clouds blanketing the earth far below. Above it, the sun slid slowly toward the horizon, gilding the clouds in gold and rose, like an ocean of fire frozen in stillness. Frank's eyes softened, and somewhere deep in his mind, a memory stirred. The jungle again, but not the fear, not the pain. He stood at the edge of a clearing, the dense canopy above parting just enough to let sunlight spill through, warm, forgiving rays cutting through the green. And there, across the clearing, stood Johnson, whole, unbroken, smiling that same smile from the black and white photo. No words passed between them. There was only a nod, silent, sure, and the kind of understanding that needs no language. Frank's hand shifted, brushing the brim of his cap in a small, unconscious gesture of acknowledgement. The memory faded, not ripped away, but retreating with gentle steps, leaving only a deep, warm quiet in its place. Outside the window the sky deepened, blue sinking into violet, violet into the first bruised shadows of night. Frank leaned his head back against the seat, the edges of his mouth softening in something not quite a smile. Not happiness, but peace. For the first time in years, Frank Whitaker felt the weight on his chest ease. Not gone, no, never gone, but lightened, shared, remembered. Because honor, like memory, does not diminish when it is carried together. And Frank Whitaker was no longer alone. Somewhere far below the airplane, night unfurled its slow, patient hand across the land. Cities blinked to life in distant clusters. Rivers caught the last hints of gold before yielding to the silver hush of darkness. Inside the cabin the lights were dimmed, and the steady hum of flight settled back into the background, quiet and constant. Frank Whitaker sat still, his eyes half-lidded, the worn cap resting in his lap like a folded flag. Around him, life returned to its rhythms. Drinks poured, seatbelts clicked, soft laughter resumed in careful whispers, but none of it touched him. He was elsewhere, in the space between memory and forgiveness. No medals gleamed on his chest. No banners marked his journey. There was only the simple dignity of a man who had given much and asked for nothing. And now, after all these years, a small piece of what he carried had been seen, acknowledged, remembered. Some sacrifices are invisible. Some battles are fought long after the guns fall silent. And some heroes walk among us, not with trumpets or fanfare, but with quiet, enduring grace. Time steals many things, but not honor. Not the memory of those who tried and kept trying, even when no one saw. Frank Whitaker leaned his head against the window, the last band of sunlight brushing the clouds like a benediction. He closed his eyes, not in weariness, but in peace. Outside, the stars began to blink awake, one by one, stitching the heavens together with threads of quiet light. Today, we remember. Always forward. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Where are you watching from? Comment below to honor all who served with quiet courage.